Life of David Livingston, Part 29. The scenery was getting more sublime every day, and we advanced northward, even approaching the terrible. We seemed to have left the monotony of the desert for the wild, picturesque scenery of the Abyssinia and the terrible mountains of the Sierra Nevadas. I named the tabular mountain, which recalled memories of the Abyssinian campaign, Megalada, and as I gave it the place in my chart, it became a great use to me, and as it rose prominently to view, that I was enabled to lay down our route pretty accurately for 4 days. Provisions we had taken with us were soon consumed, and still we were far from the Malagartsi River, though we eked out my own stores with great care, as shipwrecked men at sea. These also gave out on the 6th day, and still the Malagartsi was not in sight. The country was getting more and more difficult to travel, owing to the numerous ascents and descents we had to make in the course of a day's march. Bleached and bare, it was cut up by the 1,000 deep ravines and intersected by 1,000 dry watercourses, whose beds were filled with immense sandstone rocks and boulders washed away from the great heights which rose above us on every side. We were not protected now by the shades of the forest, and the heat became excessive and water became scarce, but we still held on our way, hoping that each day's march would bring us in sight of the long-looked-for, much-desired Malagartsi. Fortunately, we had filled our bags and baskets with the forest peaches, and which the forests of Rusawa had supplied us, and these sustained us in this extremity. Proceeding on our road on the 8th day, everything we saw tended to confirm us in the belief that food was at hand, and traveling 2 hours, still descended rapidly toward the deep basin, which we saw the foremost of the expedition halted, attracted by the sight of a village situated on a table-topped mountain on our right. The guide told us it must be that of the son of Nzogara of Yavinza. We followed the road leading to the foot of the mountain and camped on the edge of the extensive morass. Though we fired guns to announce our arrival, it was unnecessary, for the people were already hurrying to our camps to inquire about our intentions. The explanation was satisfactory, but they said that they had taken us to be enemies, few friends having ever come along our road. In a few minutes there was an abundance of meat grain in the camp, and the men's jaws were busy in the process of mastication. During the whole of the afternoon we were engaged upon the terms Nzogara's son extracted for the privilege of passage through their country. We found him to be the first of a tribute-taking tribe, which subsequently made much havoc in the bales of the expedition. 7.5 doti of cloth were what we were compelled to pay, whether we returned or proceeded on our way. After a day's halt, we proceeded under the guidance of the men granted as qualified to show the way to the Malagartsi River. We had to go east-northeast for the considerable amount of time in order to avoid the morass, and laid directly across the country that intervened between the triangular mountain on whose top Nzogara's son dwelt. This marsh drains three extensive ranges of mountain, which, starting from the westward, separated only by 2 deep chasms from each other, run at wide angles on southeast, northeast, and other northwest. From a distance, this marsh looks fair enough. Stately trees at intervals rise seemingly from its bosom, and between them one catches a glimpse of a lovely champaign, bounded by perpendicular mountains in the far distance. After a wide detour, we struck straight for this marsh, which presented to us novelty in the watershed of the Tanganyika. Presented to us another novelty in the watershed of the Tanganyika. Fancy a river broad as the Hudson at Albany, though not near as deep or swift, covered over by water plants and grasses which had become so interwoven and netted together as to form a bridge covering the entire length and breadth, under which the river flowed calm and deep below. It was over this natural bridge we were expected to cross. Adding to the tremor which one naturally felt at having to cross this frail bridge was the tradition that only a few yards higher up an Arab and his donkey, 35 slaves, and 16 tusks of ivory had suddenly sunk forever out of sight. As one half of our little column had already arrived at the center, we were on the shore, could see the network of grasses weaving on either side, in one place like to the swell of a sea after a storm, in another like the small lake violently ruffled by a squall. Hundreds of yards away from them it ruffled and undulated, one wave after another. As we all got on it, we perceived it to sink about a foot, forcing the water on which it rested into the grassy channel formed by our footsteps. One of my donkeys broke through, and it required the united strength of 10 men to extricate it. The aggregate weight of the donkey and men caused that portion of the bridge on which they stood to sink about 2 feet, and a circular pool of water was formed. And I expected every minute to see them suddenly sink out of sight. Fortunately, we managed to cross the treacherous bridge without accident. Arriving on the other side, we struck north, passing through a delightful country, in every way suitable for agriculture, settlements, or happy mission stations. The primitive rock began to show itself anew in eccentric clusters as a flat-topped rock on which the villages of the Wavinza were seen, and where the natives prided themselves on the security and conducted themselves accordingly, ever insolent and forward. We were halted every 2 or 3 miles by a demand for tribute, which we did not because we could not pay. On the second day after leaving Nedzoraga's son, we commenced a series of descents, the deep valleys on each side of astonishing us by their profundity, and the dark gloom prevailing below, amid their wonderful dense forests and tall trees and glimpses of plains beyond, invited sincere admiration. In about a couple of hours, we discovered the river we were looking for below, at a distance of a mile, running like a silver vein through the broad valley. Halting at Kilah's eldest son of Ntzagera, the principal sultan of Uvinza, we waited an hour to see on what terms he would ferry us over the Malagartsi. As we could not come to a definite conclusion respecting them, we were obliged to camp in his village. Until 3:00 p.m. the following day continued the negotiations for ferrying us across the Malagartsi, consisting of arguments, threats, quarrels, loud shouting, stormy debate on both sides. Finally, 6 doti and 10 fundo of sami beads were agreed upon, after which we marched to the ferry, distant half a mile from the scene of much contention. The river at the place was not more than 30 yards broad, sluggish and deep, yet I would prefer attempting to cross the Mississippi by swimming rather than the Malagartsi. Such another river, for the crocodiles, cruel as death, I cannot conceive. Their long, tapering heads dotted the river everywhere, and though I amused myself pelting them with 2-ounce balls, I made no effect on their numbers. 2 canoes had discharged their live cargo on the other side of the river when the story of Captain Burton's passage across the Malagartsi River higher up was brought vividly to my mind by the exhortations which Mutaware now commenced. Quote, 2 marches from Malagartsi brought us to Yuha. Kawanga was the first place in Yuha where we halted. It was the village where resides the first mutwer, or chief, to whom caravans have to pay tribute. To this man we paid 12.5 doti, upon the understanding that we would have to pay even no more between here and Ujiji. We left Kawanja carefully enough. The country undulated gently before us like the prairie of Nebraska, as devoid of trees almost as our plains. The top of every wave of land enabled us to see scores of villages which dotted the surface, though it required keen eyes to detect at a distance the beehived and straw-thatched huts from the bleached grass of the plain. Pursuing our way next day, after a few hours' march, we came to Kalirigi and quartered ourselves in a large village governed by Minovu's brother, who had already been advised by Minovu of the wildfall in store for him. This man, as soon as we had set the tent, put a claim for 30 doti, which I was able to reduce after much eloquence lasting over 5 hours to 26 doti. I saw my fine array of bales being reduced fast. For much demands as Minovu's would leave me, an unclassic phrase, cleaned out. After paying this last tribute, as it was night, I closed my tent and, lighting my pipe, began to think seriously upon my position and how to reach Ujiji without paying more tribute. It was high time to resort either to a battle or to a strange strategy of some kind, possibly to striking out into the jungle. But there was no jungle in Yuha, and a man might be seen miles off on its naked plains. At least this was the plan most likely to succeed without endangering the prospects almost within reach of the expedition. Calling the guide, I questioned him as to its feasibility. He said there was a Maguna, a slave of Thani bin Abdullah, in the Kama, with whom I might consult. Sending for him, he presently came, and I began to ask him for how much he would guide us out of Yuha without being compelled to pay any more muhongo. He replied that it was a hard thing to do, unless I had complete control over my men, and they could not get to do exactly as they could be got to do exactly as I told them. When satisfied on this point, he entered into an agreement to show me a road, or rather to lead me to it, that might be clear of all inhabitants as far as Ujiji. For 12 doti paid beforehand, the cloth was paid to him at once. At 2:30 in the morning, the men were ready and stealing silently past the huts. The guide opened the gates, and we filed out one by one as quickly as possible. At dawn, we crossed the swift Zunutsi, which flowed northward into the Malagartsi, after which we took a northwesterly direction through a thick jungle of bamboo. There was no road, and behind us we left but little trail on the hard, dry ground. At 8 in the morning we halted for breakfast, having marched nearly 6 hours within the jungle, which stretched for miles all around us.